What if I told you some of the world's most celebrated paintings, those fancy schmancy ones now hanging in the grandest museums, were stolen? Not by burglars in the night, but by a revolution. In the early 20th century, Russia stood at the crossroads of cultural glory and impending chaos. Behind the gilded doors of aristocratic palaces and merchant mansions lay treasures, masterpieces of Western and Russian art, private collections that rivaled the greatest galleries in Europe. These weren't just decorations. They were obsessions, symbols of prestige, proof that Russia too could sit at the table of European brilliance. Then came the revolution, and everything changed. This isn't just a tale of politics or ideology. It's not even a Netflix heist, documentary pitch. It's a story of loss, of smuggled canvases, underground networks, secret auctions, and cultural betrayal. Welcome to the untold story of how a revolution didn't just rewrite history, it erased masterpieces from it. Okay, quick pit stop. Last video, we hit you with a brain teaser. Which painter made almost 200 pieces but only sold one in his lifetime? If you yelled Van Gogh into your screen, you win. No prize, just bragging rights. We made a video about one of his most wild and prestigious painting. Check the link in the description. If you did not get the last one correct, we have another teaser waiting at the end of the video. Now, back to the art heist. Before the storm, there was glittering opulence. Picture this: early 20th century Russia. Aristocrats and industrialists weren't just rich, they were cultured rich. In 1917, as the Bolsheviks seized power, art became more than beauty or culture. It became property, confiscated, smuggled, sold, hidden, and lost. This is the untold story of how the Russian Revolution didn't just topple a monarchy, it unraveled a nation's soul by stealing its art. Picture it: Russia, early 20th century, caviar's still cold, the vodka's flowing, and behind the velvet curtains of aristocratic mansions sit the actual greatest art collections outside of France. Before the storm of revolution, Russia enjoyed what some call a golden age of art collecting. The country's elite, particularly the rising class of industrialist merchants, turned their immense wealth toward art. And not just icons or landscapes, but the bold, controversial works of modern Europe, because why not? One of the most iconic names, Sergei Shchukin. Born into wealth, Shchukin became obsessed with French art. He brought home works by Monet, Matisse, Cézanne, Picasso, pieces considered radical at the time. His mansion in Moscow was no mere home. It was a private museum, a shrine to modernism. He commissioned Matisse to paint murals. He bought Gauguin before they were fashionable. He even endured public ridicule for the strangeness of his collection. Then, there was Ivan Morozov. Another industrialist, Morozov's tastes were slightly more conservative, but no less impressive. His collection held over 240 masterpieces: Van Gogh, Renoir, Pissarro. And unlike Shchukin, Morozov was deeply methodical, building his gallery with scholarly precision. By 1917, these two men had assembled perhaps the greatest collections of French Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art outside of France. And they did it not for status, but out of vision, out of love. But love, in a time of revolution, means little. When Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, their message was clear: all private property must serve the proletariat. That included land, factories, mansions, and yes, art. In a Sean McMeekin's book, he mentioned that the Bolsheviks would fund their activities by holding up banks and stealing gold. After seizing power in November 1917, these leopards didn't change their spots. But maybe this time they were doing it under the umbrella of holding the country's power. They needed cash to pay the Red Guards, who had staged the coup. The revolutionary government moved swiftly. In December 1918, Lenin signed a decree nationalizing all private collections. Hundreds of thousands of artworks were seized. No compensation. No due process. The state simply arrived and took them. But this was more than theft. It was ideological. To the Bolsheviks, the aristocracy's art represented oppression. The new Soviet regime envisioned a culture for the masses, accessible and unbound by bourgeois decadence. So they repurposed palaces into museums. They hung Matisse and Monet in buildings once owned by bankers. But stripping away the gold frames and chandeliers didn't cleanse the history. In fact, many of the artworks carried the very revolutionary spirit the Bolsheviks sought to claim. Yet, paradoxically, the regime condemned the Western decadence embedded in modern art, while showcasing it as proof of Russia's revolutionary taste. Key institutions were born from this effort, most notably the State Museum of New Western Art, an amalgamation of the Shchukin and Morozov collections. The irony? The avant-garde works the regime displayed in the 1920s were later condemned under Stalin as degenerate. Some were hidden, others destroyed. Behind closed doors, bureaucrats debated which works were ideologically acceptable. Was Picasso too abstract? Was Matisse too French? Meanwhile, curators walked a tightrope, balancing preservation with political survival. Letters from Igor Grabar describe frantic attempts to inventory pieces before they vanished. Some collectors attempted to hide works in cellars or behind false walls. A few succeeded. Most failed. The Bolsheviks weren't just seizing art, they were rewriting culture. By the early 1920s, famine and civil war ravaged the Soviet Union. Lenin's government was broke, and in art, it saw a solution. The strategy had a name: Torgsin, short for trade with foreigners. Torgsin stores allowed the Soviet state to exchange cultural goods for hard currency: gold, dollars, sterling. To the outside world, it looked like a quiet fire sale. To insiders, it was the draining of Russia's soul. Priceless icons, Fabergé eggs, and paintings were sold at basement prices. The state authorized agents like Antikvariat, a secretive bureau tasked with offloading cultural assets. They worked through European auction houses and shadowy intermediaries. Some of the greatest paintings of the 19th and early 20th centuries changed hands in dimly lit rooms. Among the buyers, American moguls like Andrew Mellon, whose acquisitions would later seed the National Gallery of Art in Washington. German, art dealers, French collectors, even Nazi intermediaries, each saw Soviet desperation as an opportunity. In 1931 alone, at least 250 paintings from the Hermitage were sold, including works by Raphael, Rembrandt, and Van Dyck. The secrecy was absolute. Only a handful of Soviet officials knew the full extent of what was leaving the country. Reports emerged of entire train cars loaded with art bound for Western Europe. Many pieces were never catalogued. Others vanished from Soviet records entirely. To this day, no complete list exists, but they could use small art pieces on the list of trade goods for decoy. The export goods specifications list of the People's Commissariat of Foreign Trade included 917 items besides such traditional Russian exports as timber, furs, caviar, and handicrafts. It had an unusual new section: items of artistic value. This is how some of the small, not paintings, were given away. Meanwhile, museum curators, some of whom had risked their lives preserving the art, were ordered to prepare shipping crates. Their protests were ignored. A handful resigned in silent defiance. The Soviet Union was trading away its memory, one masterpiece at a time. Today, many of these looted works sit behind velvet ropes in the world's grandest museums. Few label them as looted. Fewer still acknowledge their controversial paths, but legal battles continue. Descendants of collectors like Shchukin and Morozov have sued, sometimes against governments, sometimes against museums. They argue that these works were taken under duress, that the so-called nationalization was nothing but theft under the guise of ideology. But international law is slow and complicated. Most courts defer to sovereign immunity, meaning you can't sue a foreign government for acts committed within its own borders. And so the heirs wait and fight and lose again and again. One such case involved Cézanne's Madame Cézanne, sold to Western buyers during a fire sale of Soviet treasures. The family of the original owner filed claims. The case was dismissed. Museums argue they are protectors of culture, that the artworks now educate millions. That restitution would fracture public access. And in some ways, they're not wrong. This is the question at the heart of it all. Can a revolution erase ownership? Can ideology overwrite legacy? Is art a national treasure or a family heirloom? There are no easy answers. What is clear is that the Russian Revolution didn't just change governments. It scattered Russia's cultural identity across continents. Today, exhibitions in Paris or New York proudly feature works from Shchukin and Morozov. Some museums now acknowledge their origins, some don't, but each painting has a story, a wall it once hung on, a family who cherished it, a nation who lost it. The revolution stole more than power. It stole voices, memories, brushstrokes, and in the silence that followed, a new kind of art history began, written not in pigment, but in exile. History often remembers revolutions as acts of fire and blood, but in the shadows, they also take quieter victims, like a Monet wrapped in burlap, a Matisse smuggled across a border, a collection dissolved by decree. Today, you'll find those same paintings, collected out of love, seized out of fear, hanging in Paris, New York, London, viewed by millions, whispering the names of those who once loved them. Some museums acknowledge their origins, most don't. This was their story. All right, it's that time where you have to check your art knowledge. It's a painting drove Edvard Munch to madness. What is this painting? For interesting art stories like this, please subscribe to the channel so that you never miss a video. Oh, and don't forget to like and share the video. It helps us grow. Thank you, and see you in the next video.